Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we are on Elizabeth Peters' Crocodile and the Sandbank, which is book one of the Amelia Peabody series. And this is a series that I got into one summer when I was staying with my grandmother, and my grandmother had extremely strict ideas about what counted as good literature or bad literature. She is eternally notorious with my father and mother and me for having once effectively declared that, what was it? Brave New World, the Aldous Huxley novel, the science fiction master Aldous Huxley, that guy, that Brave New World could not have been science fiction. Why? Because it's good. She had overly absorbed because my grandmother was born in the 20s. So, you're talking about somebody who grew up in the era when genre fiction was seen as extremely lesser. This is something that has, of course, over time undergone a shift because science fiction gradually became respectable, and we know that there was that burst of seeing fantasy as being respectable following the Lord of the Rings trilogy films, which brought the Lord of the Rings out of semi-obscure. I mean, obviously they'd never been obscure, but they were something that, only nerds really cared about. But then you get these massive 3 epic films, and suddenly everybody is seeing fantasy as being as valid a genre as anything else. Murder mysteries, I think, had always been seen, and historical fiction had always been seen, I suspect, as slightly more respectable because they were taking place in the quote-unquote real world. But anyhow, Crocodile and the Sandbank was not the first book that I read. I was staying with my grandmother, and I needed something to read, and I frankly, while she had large numbers of books in her home, as one does, or as the people in my circles normally do, the problem was that her tastes ran to much more serious things. As you may have noticed by the vast majority of books on this channel, my tastes in reading do not generally run to books that could be deemed serious. Putting aside things like the Memorial to My Mother or the Literary Chatter series or anything really recommended by my father that I have made a series out of, my father, the literature PhD, who reads, serious books and thinks Henry James is amazing and, and will go to bat and has genuine, serious opinions about not Gulliver's Travels. What's that book? James Joyce. That James Joyce book with the things and the language. Anyways, he has whatever that's called. It's not coming to me. It'll come to me after I'm done recording this video. And if anybody shows up in the comments, because goodness knows, people don't really show up in the comments all that much on these videos, but if somebody does, there will probably be somebody who will know what book I'm talking about, and will make me feel like an idiot for not remembering the title. Anyways, for the record, of course, I never remember titles or names, so, that's just how I function in the world. But the point is, getting back to things, this is called Bookish Ramblings for a reason. The point is, getting back to this, I just wound up picking a book off the shelf because I needed something to read because it was summer and I was trapped living with my grandmother, and I wanted something. So I read my first Elizabeth Peters, Amelia Peabody book, and I enjoyed it, and I looked up others. But I kind of adore this first book in the series. It sets the stage wonderfully. So, what is the stage? The stage in this is a historical murder mystery. That is, this is set in the 1880s. So we're talking Victorian era, and one of the interesting things you should note is that Elizabeth Peters, in her author's note at the start of this book, makes it clear that, among other things, in order to add verisimilitude to the narrative, I have used the contemporary spellings of names and places and pharaohs, as well as certain words like Dahabia. For example, the name of the heretic pharaoh was formerly read as Kuenaten. Modern scholars prefer the reading Akhenaten. Similarly, Userten is the modern Senusert. That is, pronunciations and understanding of how the ancient Egyptian language sounded and worked and so on has changed across the centuries because, yes, of course, you had the Rosetta Stone and it allowed people to translate. But the problem is that ultimately translation off of the Rosetta Stone was working backwards from, well, we know this thing has to be the name here, and so this is the proper name, so this should probably sound the same. Except that, among other things, anybody who has ever studied multiple languages will know that words in one language, that words crossing languages, proper names, don't always cross languages as accurately as one might like. You know, we anglicize things all the time in English, and I assume, I don't know the word for it in other languages, but I assume other languages have words for it, that if you're in French, you know, franconify? I don't know. There must be a word for that somewhere. But I'm not going to look it up because that would be effort, and so on. That you get these words, these place names that change from one language to another. I mean, after all, you know, England in French is still Angleland as it is in English. It's just Angleterre because Angle, terre, land. You know, Germany in German is Deutschland, whereas we call it Germany. You know, and I believe, I could be misremembering, but in French it's Allemagne. My French is mediocre on a good day. The point is that all of those names have changed across the centuries, but there is also the very, very English tendency to anglicize things to a fare thee well, such as the Italians who call their capital city Roma. The English decided that they can't handle the extra syllable and just called it Rome. And Firenze becoming Florence. It's very, very English to just squash a name into something that is more convenient. Like Don Quixote becoming Don Quixote. So what you have, so you have those sorts of things. You have the state of archaeological work and understanding and development, and the thing is that, you know, going into this, you have to understand that archaeology started out as pretty much just looting with some vague interest in other stuff on the side. I mean, Heinrich Schliemann is well known for thinking he found Troy and then saying, I'm going to take all of the gold stuff I find and show it off to people, because, look at that. You know, which is vastly different from today when an archaeologist, they'll be delighted to find something that's a dramatic piece that you can have a museum talk up and get you extra funding, but they're much more interested in 1,000,001 potsherds that tell them a complex story because they figured it out, because they can look at where things are located in a room and figure out usage from, you know, place and level within, you know, layers of dirt and all that kind of stuff. But if you go back to the 1880s, this was the earliest days of archaeology, and people were still figuring that stuff out. They were still making a shift from what is, despite what all they may have thought at the time, pretty much just tomb robbing for glory, and shifting that into actually genuinely studying things to figure out things about ancient peoples. So Amelia Peabody is an Englishwoman who has inherited a vast fortune and decides, after inheriting her fortune and getting her money clear and so on, decides she's going to go on a grand tour and just, see stuff. She's going to go and see the world. She is mostly misanthropic, but when she finds a young woman unconscious on the ground, she picks up this young Englishwoman and effectively brings her with, because this young Englishwoman has been extremely ill-used. She was convinced, the young woman, Evelyn, was convinced that she was, oh dear, I hope that the screen going dark didn't show up on my video, but I am too lazy to recheck whether or not that did anything. Evelyn was misused by a young man, and basically he convinced her that she was in love with him, and she ran away from home, and it's a whole very sad, very Victorian story. But Amelia picks her up and brings Evelyn with her, and they move on and travel to Egypt, where in the due course of events they meet two men, brothers, and she discovers a love of Egypt and a love of archaeology, and there's a murder mystery during the whole thing. But during this process, we have this wonderful woman who, she arrives in Egypt and decides that she needs to get a medical kit in case something goes wrong and someone needs treatment. And she has this wonderful comment right after she gets it, that was disappointed that she hadn't been able to amputate anybody's limbs. She had been looking forward to this. It's this wild notion, just this wild statement from this woman of, I was actually disappointed. I was looking forward to treating people's amputations. And I was sorry nobody had lost a finger. And it's just, she comes out with these wild statements. And, in between these statements, she is constantly talking about how she is dull and sensible and just endlessly pragmatic. And if ever there was, in a very odd way, she is a marvelously unreliable narrator, because she appears to not understand that men might be attracted to an extremely large bosom, that she apparently has an extremely a gracious figure, rather than being slender. She is, extremely heavy on top in attractive ways, or ways that one can presume are attractive based on other people's reactions and her statements that appear to be misunderstanding the facts of the matter. And so it's a very interesting thing to read, and read in between the lines. There is also a love story or two or three or 2.5. There's a fake out love story thing happening. Anyways, and it's not a murder mystery, really. I mean, I think somebody does die, but they're almost not even really looking into that. They're more concerned about not being able to finish excavating the site. Anyhow, so it's an extremely good time, and yeah, so I'll probably be going through this series for a while. I think it jumps the shark somewhere around in one of the later books, but that's fine. I got a good way to go before I actually hit the point where it jumps the shark, and in the meantime, I will get to enjoy Amelia Peabody saying absolutely remarkable statements, which, yeah, is very much her charm. So, that's everything, and I will see you all next week.